All right, everyone, now it's time to talk about Brexit because it's looking like Boris Johnson is essentially challenging, potentially at least, the Queen to fire him. What looks like it's shaping up is there will be a no confidence vote, and the Parliament there might try to kick Boris Johnson out, but he's threatening to basically ignore them and force the Queen herself to act. It'd be interesting because what this fundamentally boils down to, when you really think about it, a situation like that is the Queen going to support the will of Parliament or the will of the Democratic majority of the UK plus Boris Johnson? It's not really supporting Johnson. The people already held a vote. They held a referendum, which was backed, including by some people who were Remainers. They said, let the people decide. The majority of people in the UK voted to leave the EU. Therefore, they've already spoken. When they say, well, we need a people's referendum, well, years ago you had one. The idea that the population has changed slightly in the last several years means that you have to have another vote is pretty crazy, especially when, if you look at people's opinion, it appears that more people would actually back Brexit this time around if you did have such a vote. It would increase in the likelihood of having a Brexit because a lot of people would be really pissed off about the idea of having a second referendum at all. I would say, for stability's sake, it's very likely that she wouldn't fire him. I think ultimately she may just come out and say, look, you had a referendum. We've got to have a deal eventually. It's not going anywhere. What do you expect to be accomplished? Either that or the Queen, if the Queen was smart, what she'd do is this. She'd say it's fundamentally incapable, it's fundamentally impossible for the people to be governed by Parliament at this point, so I'm just going to dissolve you, get rid of Boris Johnson, and take command myself. Maybe the Queen should deal with that. She'd probably be quicker. They'd probably be more intelligent. There is something to be said for autocracy in certain situations. I say that half tongue in cheek. I back Boris Johnson fundamentally because if people have decided to have a Brexit, you've already held your vote. Why not have your no deal Brexit? It's the EU is trying to stonewall. And some EU countries, I think, are getting pissed off anyway. They're going to kick you out anyway at some point. They're going to say, well, what do you expect us to do? We can't govern our own affairs when we've got this country, a large economy, by the way, in limbo constantly. It's a distraction. It would be better for all parties involved, for the EU and for the UK, if the UK were to have a hard Brexit, which is what people voted for fundamentally anyway. Not for a sweetheart deal that gives the EU 99% of what it wants and gives the UK absolutely nothing. What Theresa May did is engineer a deal in which basically, if you look at the Chequers agreement that was struck, the UK would be subject to all of the same rules and regulations it already is as a member of the European Union, except that it wouldn't even have a vote. It wouldn't even have a chair at the table. It wouldn't even exist in an advisory capacity. It'd be subjugated to rules that it's not even taking part in making. Arguably a much worse position than even having been just a normal EU member state. At least as a member of the EU, it had the vote, it had a large economy, it could swing around diplomatically, at least in the unofficial capacity, and be sort of the third wheel with Germany and France. That's basically what it had before. Now you don't have that. Now you've got the UK will leave the EU. Fundamentally, it's already triggered its article, it will leave. It's slated for Halloween, like in a few weeks. Just fucking have a hard Brexit, and then turn around and begin negotiating for trade and things. This is what Nigel Farage has suggested. He was the only wise man at the time. That he was the voice in the wilderness proclaiming Brexit was possible and would actually happen against all possible odds. He was right for years before it was a popular movement. He managed to get that movement off of the ground. He now runs one of the larger political movements within the UK. The Parliament there is playing with fire by attempting to continuously block the will of a significant proportion of the UK's population. It looks like there's maybe 20-30% of the UK's population is diehard pro-Brexit. These individuals cannot be ignored. There's also a component that brings it overall to about half the population that's more soft support. I think there's a lot of soft Remain support as well. There are a lot of people who want to stay in the European Union for various reasons, but who don't seem too gung-ho about it. I've actually spoken with some of them. They're like, yeah, there are some advantages, though, to being part of this particular political union, and I don't want to leave, but it's not the end of the world. I would just prefer that. And I've spoken with people that are pro-Brexit that are kind of the same. I think the pro-Brexit group is a little bit more diehard. I think there's more fervor on the pro-Brexit side, certainly, by a significant margin. I would say for political stability's sake, you'd want to side with Brexit if you're the Queen. She should just say, well, no, I'm not going to sack Boris Johnson. You know, you've got this referendum, you're trying to block him, whatever. But the thing is, she's been tight-lipped. It's like, you know, as an American, I'm not pro-monarchy. By the way, sometimes when I say I'm a minarchist, people think I'm saying monarchist. Minarchy is basically a soft variant libertarianism as opposed to ANCAP, as opposed to being an anarchist. I just want smaller government, I want less taxes, less regulation, I want to be left alone. That's basically what I want politically, in a nutshell. Leave me alone. That's my political ideology. But at the same time, I can sort of respect the fact that the royals there in the UK have been tight-lipped, not necessarily expressing a great deal of public sentiment for or against it, and just saying, well, if people have spoken, you've got a Brexit, blah, blah, blah. Now, I think that the Queen also, wouldn't she want sovereignty for the UK? It gives her arguably a little bit more leverage herself. It gives the royal bloodline more leverage because you're not dealing with this whole other group of bureaucrats and billionaires that have, you know, various political powers. I would think that the more sovereign the entity is, the more so you get an internal sense of patriotism potentially too. Like some people consider themselves now to be European, they don't even consider themselves to be members of their own nation state. I think that's a negative thing. I think people should should have value in their culture. They should like, you know, their culture. You can express all the criticism in the world that you want, but fundamentally fight for it. If you think that it's doing things wrong, try to change them, but don't expect some third-party post-national entity to do it for you. It'll only screw up. I think the EU is doomed anyway. The UK is better off without it. Just happens to be my own opinion looking at the political situation here, all over Europe, from the outside looking in the past, but now from the inside looking in, I guess, you know, things seem fairly stable, but the EU as a political entity itself is pure chaos. What it does is it takes a bunch of disparate economies and mashes them all together under one currency, and it takes a bunch of different groups of people and gives them free movement internally, which is actually a great idea. It's very streamlined, trust me, it is quite efficient, but then it has migrant crises, member states haul off and bomb some country in the third world, and then 1 million refugees show up and other states are absorbing them. You have constant disagreements between East and West Europe, it seems, especially on that, between places like Poland and Hungary that know what it's like to be post-national and the suffering that it causes, and then Western Europe, which has never had that problem, that's taking it up for the first time and expecting that because we are European, we will be able to manage that high level of centrality without corruption. I don't agree. I don't think that it's physically possible. I think centrality will inevitably collapse the European experiment. And the problem is that harms Europe long term. I think that the quicker that the EU dissolves, the stronger Europe arguably will actually be. That's about all. Peace out.